Okay, so I want to pick up in August the 12th, 1918. The predominant passion of Luisa, that Jesus free her from the bother that he has put on her. Now, you wouldn't expect that this would come back in volume 12, but it has, because in volumes 1 to 4, Luisa was annoying Jesus all the time by saying, I don't need the priest to come. Can you just get rid of the priest? Now, she didn't say it as awfully as that, you know what I mean? But I mean, she was telling him she didn't want the priest. We're back to it. Before I even start this, I want to give you Isaiah 55, 8 to 9. Isaiah 55, 8 to 9 says, My thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. My ways are as different from yours as the heavens are from the earth. And it's just difficult for us to realize that the Lord just doesn't think the way we do. So, continue in my usual state, Luisa said, I was thinking to myself that if the Lord wanted a certain thing from me, he should give me a sign. Now, I would have thought that at this stage, for her, she would have been beyond signs. Okay. When you're very early in the spiritual life, you want a sign. It sort of says, if this is right, you do this. Remember Gideon in the book of Judges? Yeah, you put the dew on the fleece and then I'll know that it's you. And when he got the dew on the fleece, he said, well, you wouldn't mind doing it the opposite way and then I'll be sure. That's called unbelief. Okay. So you don't expect her to be looking for a sign at this particular point. So he should give me a sign. And the sign would be that it was of freeing me from the coming of the priest. I say, oh no, we're not back to this again. I'm sure you've had experiences in home life of saying, no, this subject isn't coming back again, is it? And blessed Jesus made himself seen in my interior. Now notice it's in her interior. He's not coming out. With a ball in his hand, as though in the act of throwing it on the ground. And then he told me, my daughter, this is your predominant passion. It's the thing you keep going back to. Now, one of the best things to get rid of in Lent, if you can, is the predominant passion. The others are easier to deal with. That I free you from the bother. Now, notice bother is just annoying her. But do you remember Paul said he had a thorn in his side? Well, this is hers. He said, I keep you in this state for the whole world. Now notice the for and ring that. That's the important word. You're not in this for yourself. You're not in this for some kind of personal perfection for yourself. This is something I'm doing for the whole world. Everybody has to benefit from this. And I use you as not to send the world to ruin completely. Now, Luisa has heard that time out of number, which we find it very difficult to take on board, that my reactions have such a consequence. So, in other words, she's in this bed, going through this experience for the church and for the world. And she's already been told eloquently that the church is like a building that's leaning on her. While this other thing with which you could do good is a small part. He said, in other words, the thing that's irritating you is something small. But that's the way it is with us, isn't it? It can be something quite small that really irritates us. And we find it intolerable. So Luisa said, my Jesus, I'm unable to understand this. Well, we get that one. You keep me without suffering. Now, there she has held on to her old idea of suffering. She tells us that every single message she's going through hell because of the privation, but apparently that isn't suffering. See what I mean? In other words, when we're looking at ourselves, we can't see the wood for the trees. That's the reason why it's good to have somebody outside to reflect something to you. When she says, you leave me without suffering, in other words, she's not being crucified as she was in volumes 1 to 4. Okay? Jesus began to change her, and she hasn't really grasped that everything is now on a divine level. Okay? It seems that you keep me suspended from the state of victim. And then you tell me that you use me in order to not to send the world completely to ruin. And Jesus said, yes, it is false that you don't suffer. Of course it's false. She's going through hell when she doesn't see him. At the most, you do not suffer such pains as to be able to disarm me completely. But if sometimes you remain suspended, your part, your will, is not in it. Now, if her will was in it, then the disasters on the world would be so much greater. Because it seems to me, I could be wrong, ladies are now allowed to be infallible, which is great. It seems to me that the two people who upheld the 20th century were Padre Pio and Luisa. Now, there were other victim souls as well, but they seem to have been the two big ones. And so Jesus said that if he suspends her, her will isn't in it, so it's okay. But here, your will would enter. She wants to get rid of this irritation. You cannot understand the sweet violence you do to me with your waiting. Now that's Matthew 11:12. The kingdom of God suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. Now also the value of waiting upon the Lord, the famous one, is Isaiah 40:31. Isaiah 40:31. Those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like the eagle. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. So Luisa doesn't grasp the enormity of the thing that's going on, that when she waits in agony for the Lord to come back. So feeling suspended, not seeing me as you used to, and remaining in the same place. That means doing your work of intercession as before, without moving anything. He said, that's what does it. You remain faithful. And besides, I want to be free over you whenever I please. I will keep you suspended, and when I don't, I will keep you bound. I want you at the mercy of my will. Now that is the hardest thing for us. Because no matter what you say to the Lord about, I give myself to you, I consecrate myself to you, we want a little bit of control still. We find it extremely difficult to feel, I am not calling the shots. I mean, I've often said to people that one of the reasons why I hate travelling in airplanes is that I have no control over what happens. You're sitting there at the mercy of somebody in the front, you know. I remember on one very difficult airplane ride that I took to Glasgow in very bad weather, and there's cross winds just at the point where the plane goes over the Irish Sea. I went so white that the air hostess said to me, would you like to talk to the two lads? I said, oh my God. I was bad enough until then, but now I was in a proper tizzy, and I don't know what made me say yes. So I said yes. Those were the days when they'd allow you to talk to the pilots. So I went up and I saw these two young men in the cockpit, and one of them turned around and he said, what's your problem? And I said, I had a problem before I came to the cockpit. I said, now I have two. And instinctively he laughed. He said, what's your second one? I said, my life is in the hands of two teenagers. And he said, woman, he said, you've made my day. It was fascinating, just what was happening. And you see, it's this problem that somebody else is in control. There's not a thing you can do about it. We find this difficult. And if we find it difficult in something like an airplane, how difficult is it in your prayer life where it's entirely you and it's your interior, and we have this scary thing that, well, maybe I could be deceived, maybe I'm going in the wrong direction, you know, maybe Satan has got a hook into me. We've got all kinds of fears about it. So the fact that Jesus wants us at the mercy of his will is very, very, very difficult for us. He said, and I want it without your will. In other words, you let the two teenagers drive the aircraft and you don't interfere. I remember when we landed in Glasgow, I got the biggest wave and a kiss blown in the air from the cockpit from the two teenagers. I'm sure they were in their middle 30s, you know. And so he said to Luisa, if you are content with this, he said, you can do it. Otherwise, no. In other words, Luisa, I need your surrender. So I said to my two teenage pilots, in inverted commas, I said, the fact that I'm walking back to my seat, I said, is an incredible grace. Because I had to surrender to this thing. The bad weather, plus the youth that was up manning not that I could have done anything. You know what I mean? But the fact that you couldn't do anything doesn't mean you're going to let somebody else do it. That's the amazing thing with us. We're very logical, some of us. But Jesus said, it's not going to work without your surrender. It's that simple. Another day I was feeling ill, Luisa said, with the continuous throwing up that I do. And I was saying to Jesus, what would you miss? I love the way she approaches him. By giving me the grace of not feeling the necessity for food. In other words, instead of all this mess that's going on every day, could you just take away my need for food? You see? Logic on our side. Okay. To the point, she said, where I'm forced to throw it up. And she said, I'm only saying this to obey. In other words, the idea has come from the priest. And Jesus said, my daughter, what are you saying? Quiet, he said, don't say this anymore. You must know that if you had no need of anything, I would let the people die of starvation. She cannot grasp the importance of what's happening in her, that it's out there having an effect on the whole of humanity. I would understand that. But because you need it, since it can serve your necessities, I, for love of you and because of you, give the necessary things to others. Look at that. Because you have needs and I reach out to your needs, I therefore reach out to the needs of others. Again, Luisa wouldn't know that she was tied that closely to history and to the rest of humanity. On the other hand, by taking food and then bringing it up, you do good to others and your suffering glorifies me. Even more, how many times while you throw up, I see you suffering. And since you suffer in my will, now that's the bit you underline. She's not just suffering in the body. You're suffering in my will. I take that suffering of yours, I multiply it, and I divide it for the good of creatures. In other words, he's saying to her that no matter what happens for you, the rest of humanity is actually benefiting. And I enjoy it, and when he says I enjoy, he says I'm happy with it. And I say to myself, this is the bread of my daughter, which I give for the good of my children. So I want to give you Isaiah 40, verses 13 and 14. Isaiah 40, verses 13 and 14. I want to give you Psalm 139, verses 17 and 18. And I want to give you Romans 11, verses 33 to 36. Now, the bread that Luisa is giving to the Lord to give to other people is the sacrificing of her own will and the surrender of her own will locked into the divine will that gives God the freedom to do great things upon the earth. There's another way we can live a very important Lent, and never mind the bar of chocolate. This is much more important. That your will, locked into his will, allows him to do something incredible for this planet. If we could give him that in Lent, he wouldn't worry about anything else. I don't think we would either. So August the 19th, 1918. Jesus is tired of the vile deeds of priests. As I was in my usual state, my beloved Jesus made himself seen in my interior as though within a circle of light, because God is light, you see, 1 John 1:5. And he told me, Let's see. What good have we done today? Notice the we. You and I are one. And he looked and he looked. I believe that that circle of light was his most holy will. And that since I had united myself to his most holy will, in other words, I had fused myself, this is why he was saying this. And he added, anyway, I am tired of the vile deeds of priests. I can take no more. I would want to have done with it. Oh, how many devastated souls, how many of them disfigured, how many idolatrized. Now, idolatrized means that the worship has gone from God to something else, whatever the something else is. To use holy things in order to offend me, he said, this is the most bitter pain. This is the most execrable sin. It is the mark of total ruin, i.e. lost soul, which draws the greatest maledictions and breaks any communication between heaven and earth. I find that very frightening. I don't know about you. But he's not saying whether it is the abuse of the liturgy or the abuse of children or the abuse of whatever. I would want to eradicate these things from the earth, he said. That's Revelation 11:18. Revelation 11:18, I will destroy the destroyers of the earth. Chastisements will come and they will multiply. Death will devastate cities, many houses and roads will disappear. There will be no one to live in them. Mourning and desolation will reign everywhere. Now, I don't know if you get the message. In the last message, whatever Luisa did in the divine will affected the whole human race. Whatever sins these priests are committing is bringing devastation upon the earth. Look at the effect we have. So I want to give you Matthew 23, the whole of it, which is Jesus' indictment of the religious leaders of his own day. You know, when I read something like that, I just thank God I'm a nobody. I thank God I'm just such a little one that you can just live in your nothingness. How terrifying it is to have any office in the church or in the world, because Satan can pull you down dreadfully, and you don't even know you're being pulled. You know, you don't. He blinds your eyes and everything, so you don't realise the import of what you're doing. So it is extremely important for us to keep all the leaders of the church and state in prayer and intercession. It's terribly important. And it's not just a nice thing to do, it's actually essential for them. And so Luisa said, I prayed and prayed again, and having remained with me for a good part of the night, he was so much in suffering that I felt my heart break in pain. So he was saying this is a major problem. And this is only 1918. That's what's scary. September the 4th, 1918, again you have the laments of Jesus because of priests. As I was in my usual state, Jesus told me, my daughter, creatures want to challenge my justice. They don't want to surrender. Do you see the problem? And do you see why he keeps asking those of us who want to live in the divine will that we would surrender and surrender more, and if possible, surrender completely? So I want to give you Micah 6:8. This is all the Lord asks of you, only this, that you would act justly, that you would love tenderly, and you would walk humbly with your God. He didn't ask much, but we do everything except that. That's Micah 6:8, and it's considered by the scholars as a summary of the teaching of all the prophets. He said, they don't want to surrender. In other words, they don't want to do my will. And therefore my justice does its course against the creature. So remembering some of the earlier messages today, that they are now brushing up against that electric fence, okay? They're brushing up against justice. And these people are from all classes, high and low, excepting not even those who are said to be my ministers. Maybe these even more. So he delicately got to the point of saying the priests are sometimes worse. Now, why would the priests be worse? If you know the teaching of the Old Testament, I think it's a great drawback that Catholics have not studied the Old Testament in detail. Because if you have, you'd get messages like this. If the Lord chooses somebody, that means that head has been raised above the parapet. Prime target for Satan. Whether it's an individual, whether it's a group, whether it's a nation. And it's the very fact that that person has been called that they become a prime target for Satan. And so while they have enormous privilege and enormous grace offered to them, Satan does his damnedest to destroy them. Now, in pulling down the priest, Satan is actually trying to destroy the church. In trying to destroy the church, Satan is trying to destroy everything that Jesus gave his life for. And so we've got to wake up and realise what's actually going on and what is behind things, so that we stop putting all the blame on this particular individual who fell, if I can put it that way, and realise that we've got to go into huge intercession for the protection of the church and for the protection of the harvest of Jesus in the world. Does that make sense? Otherwise, we'd start isolating this into one particular group. You know what I mean? If you look at the world today, parents are being targeted. Wonder why? Because they're upholding family to the world. Priests are being targeted. They're upholding the church. Teachers are being targeted. They're upholding the education of children for the next generation. It's anybody who raises the head above the parapet at all. Even doctors are being forced to kill children instead of healing them. So if you see it in terms of Satan attacking the church, it'll make more sense than looking at the individuals. Is that any help? So Jesus says what poison they have. Now that poison has been put in by an enemy. And they poison those who approach them. Instead of placing me in souls, they want to place themselves. They want to be surrounded, to be known, and I remain aside. Their poisonous contact, instead of recollecting souls, distracts them from me. Instead of rendering them withdrawn into their nothingness, as we would understand, they render them more free and more faulty. More liberal, we would say, and faulty. So much so that one can see souls who have no contact with them being more good, and even though they're more withdrawn from the church. And what he's saying here is sometimes when a priest has gone bad, the little group of lay people who are absolutely leaning on them for everything can be poisoned more than someone who isn't going to church on a Sunday and isn't involved in this. That's the amazing thing. Okay. A little thought has just come into my head, and I know it didn't come from me, and that is to remind you that this is 1918, and so the infiltration of the clergy by the Freemasons, the communists first, then the Freemasons, and then the Liberati. What do you call them?
Illuminati.
Illuminati. Do you hear me, Liberati? Illuminati.
Liberace.
I'm getting old. The Illuminati. And the communists paid atheists to go into the seminaries and paid them very well. But these men had no grace. So how did they survive 6 years in a seminary? They brought in homosexuality. And this homosexuality is what has corrupted the clergy. But you need to know it was brought in by the enemy, and brought in by people whose deliberate intention was to bring down the church. Because the communists at the time said that the structure of the church was so perfect that it had to be destroyed from within. Only its own ministers could destroy it. So this is why you have Jesus lamenting about the clergy, because, and he's not telling Luisa. Luisa couldn't have coped with what was actually going on. But Taylor Marshall has written a book on the infiltration of the church now. So Jesus said, so I cannot trust anyone. I'm forced to allow that the people go far away from the churches. In other words, that people will draw back from the church. Now that's happened in Ireland as well. okay, and even draw back from the sacraments, so that their contact may not poison them more and render them more evil. Isn't that frightening? My sorrow is great, the wounds of my heart are deep, therefore pray, and united to those few good who are left, that's the remnant, compassionate my bitter sorrow. So, I want to give you 2 Corinthians 6, from verse 14 to chapter 7, verse 1. That's St. Paul telling us what we have to be prepared to put up with to actually defend the church. So 2 Corinthians 6:14 to 7:1. And I want to give you John 17, verses 15 and 16. The world hates the church, wants to destroy them. And I want to give you 1 Kings, John 17, verses 15 and 16. And I want to give you 1 Kings 19, verse 18. So in 1 Kings 18 and 19, Elijah is confronting the religious leaders of his day to go and make them choose the true God. So this is an area of real intercession that we need to get into. And it might be something we could even organise among us. Okay. So September the 25th, 1918, the office of the victim soul. I was very afflicted, Luisa said, and I felt a force in my interior of wanting to go out of my usual state. She said, what pain. I felt a mortal agony. Only Jesus can know the torment of my soul, and so on. So while I was swimming in this bitterness, my beloved Jesus, all afflicted, came, and placing one of his fingers on my mouth, he said, I have made you content, be quiet. I've done what you asked. Now don't give me the words, I don't need them. Don't you remember how many times I showed you great mortalities, cities depopulated and almost deserted, World War II, and definitely World War III, and you told me, no, don't do this. But if you want to do it, you must allow them to have the time to receive the sacraments. And I am doing this, he said. What else do you want? Now, this is the first time that you actually get an insight into World War I and II that you won't get anywhere else, and it's not in the history books. That Luisa interceded that if the Lord would allow these wars to happen, that she asked him in the divine will to make sure priests got to the soldiers in the trenches. And one of our famous priests died in the trenches. Remember Father Willie Doyle? Going to these souls. And it's beautiful to just see the prayer and the answer to it. And he says, I've done it. I've done what you asked. Okay. So I'm doing this, he said. So I want to give you Luke 11, 9 to 10. That's the prayer without ceasing. And I want to give you Mark 7, verses 23 to 25. You absolutely pray, utterly believing, and the mountain will move. Okay? So what else do you want? He said, but the heart of man is hard. That's Jeremiah 17, verses 9 to 10. The heart of man is hard. Watch this now. The heart of humanity is not completely tired. He has not touched the summit of all evils, and so he's not yet satiated. Isn't that absolutely unbelievable? So you would think that the atrocities of World War I wouldn't have produced worse atrocities in World War II. I can't even imagine what they're going to do in World War III. So he does not surrender, and he looks with indifference even upon the epidemic. We're in the middle of an epidemic, aren't we? This was the Spanish flu, 1918, and it killed at least 20 million people. So he's looking with indifference even upon the epidemic. But these are the preludes. That's only the beginning. It will come. The time will come in which I will make this generation so malignant and perverted as to almost disappear from the earth. I hope it doesn't get any worse than it is now. So I want to give you Isaiah 24, verses 1 to 23. Isaiah 24, verses 1 to 23. That's an entire nation described as having turned into a leper. I want to give you Matthew 19:8, Mark 3:5, Mark 10:5, Mark 16:14, Romans 2:5. There's a good lot of scriptures look up there now. Luisa said she was shaking when she was hearing this, but she was also praying. And she wanted to ask Jesus, what should she do? But she didn't dare. And so what Jesus said is, what I want. Now, she didn't tell Jesus in words, but he can read our thoughts. What I want, he said, on your part, is that you do not dispose yourself to doing it, although being free, you can do it. So what are you talking about? Wanting to go out of her usual state of victim. That's the first sentence of this message. And then he answers it. He said, don't do it because terrible devastation will come on the earth. He said, I want you at the mercy of my will. In these past days, it was I who pushed you to go out of your usual state. I wanted to widen the scourge of the epidemic. Look at that. Isn't that incredible? So even her temptation to go out of her state widened the epidemic. And I did not want to keep you in order for you to be more free. I don't know about you, but I find that absolutely unbelievable for the simple reason that there is I call it an epidemic going around the world. I wonder, has it hit any of us that in living in the divine will, we have the power in the divine will to push it back? Have we taken that responsibility? Do we realise that, yes, there's a crisis in the priesthood, but do we realise that in the divine will, you can push that back? And what we're pushing back is the attack of Satan so that the people can recover. Because it's Satan that's bringing on the disasters. So I think that in this time before Drummondine, it's growing up time for us. It's maturing time. That we've got to realise this incredible gift has been given to us. And we've got to take it in our hands. And we've got to actually use it for the benefit of humanity. Because I don't want the Lord to say to me, I gave you a gift, but you let them suffer anyway. And we have read already today, I will let you go. I'll see how far you will reach. Do you really want to do something? And so I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to go into another message. And I just want to say to you that we have to decide as a group, are we going to lock shields together? Jesus said, Matthew 19:18, if two of you agree concerning any matter, I will ratify it in heaven. Okay. I'm not going to ask you for an answer now. We'll meet next week. But we have to decide, will we use the power we have in the divine will to release the nation, not only from the epidemic that's threatening it, but from the terrifying attack of Satan that has brought our nation down. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. So if you would give time to thinking about that, and if you could come back next week with the decision, then we can go ahead. Because I think we have been given such a gift that we've got to say thanks to the Lord. And the reason why I'm not going into another message is that it's just after 20 to 4, and I said I'd stop at 1:45. Okay. And I think this is a good point to stop. Is that all right? And thank you for coming.